Allow me a supplementary question which is related with the previous one. In the last few years, some historians strongly believe that we have to review the history of World War I. To my mind, the latest book of Mr. Clarke, under the title Sleepwalker, consists a good example of this revisionist trend in historiography. Which is your opinion about this new trend?
Well, let me say generally. I mean, I think
it's here the book.
The book. Let me say generally. I mean, revisionism is in the nature of history. Each generation of historians are likely to revise the judgments of a previous generation. And in many respects, what Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers is doing is taking us back to where we were in the 1930s. I mean, in the 1920s, Germany stood accused of being guilty, of course, of the First World War. By the 1930s, that argument had been eroded. The general argument by then was this is a collective failure of international responsibility. In the 1960s, Germany's guilt was restored by Fritz Fischer, and we're now in a position at the beginning of the 21st century where Germany is not guilty anymore. And so this is yet another turn of a very familiar wheel, I would argue. I think there's another point too, which is that Christopher Clark's revisionism can be exaggerated. I mean, the Fischer thesis, which is what, for most Germans, he is obviously revising, the notion of German guilt, is one which has been under attack for the last 25 years. A great many historians have been saying, well, we do need to think about what other parties to this war are doing, what's happening in the other cities of Europe in July 1914. And in particular, would argue, and I would certainly have argued, that we should look at Vienna and Austria-Hungary. It's Vienna that decides to go to war, quite consciously and deliberately. There's no controversy about it. The documentary trail is very clear. The real point of this is what they're embarking on is a limited war against Serbia rather than a world war. They don't have a concept.
So, do you think that the goal of Austrian government is to have a local war with Serbia?
Yes, absolutely.
Not an extended war with the Russian Empire?
Absolutely. He knows it can't win that war. I mean, if you look at Konrad von Hötzendorf's mobilization, what is he doing? He's mobilizing for a war against Serbia. And he is hoping somehow that Germany is going to keep Russia off his back. It's an extraordinary miscalculation. Of course, Austria-Hungary is aware of the risk from Russia, but there are those who say, well, it's illogical for Russia to go to war, a conservative empire that might go through a further revolution as a consequence of that. Where I think, the revisionism that I think we really have to deal with, and which Christopher Clark subscribes to, but which actually in many ways derives from the work of Sean Beacon, is the argument about whether Russia causes this war. I mean, that's another old argument. It's an argument that Germany wanted to produce, and the Sleepwalkers goes quite a long way to accepting that, saying that Russia is so desperate to get control of Constantinople, of Istanbul, and of the Dardanelles Straits, that it's ready to go to war to do that. I don't see any direct evidence of that at all. I think you need to distinguish between the positions that states took up after the war broke out, when of course Russia wanted control of Constantinople, and what happens before. It doesn't mean you go to war to achieve this before the war. You may want Constantinople. France wanted to recover Alsace-Lorraine. There is no serious argument any longer that France went to war to recover Alsace-Lorraine. Once the war broke out, then France was in the business of recovering Alsace-Lorraine. I think the challenge here is that actually we have got no significant new evidence to reduce revisionist theories. So they are theories. That's our challenge. Christopher Clark has not got significant new evidence that will change how we interpret the origins of the First World War. So the arguments don't stop here.